one of the strangest things about it is like you look out and you see like all of these logistics hubs and factories, and you see a lot of economic activity. But this guy was explaining to me that, he might hear about one or two colleagues in the area being stopped and kidnapped every single day. And he knows people who have been kidnapped and killed, but this is his job.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
Welcome to Borderland, Narcosis, an Ironclad original presented by the best supplements in the world, First Form. You guys go pick up your supplements at firstform.com/Borderland. My next guest is Nate Flannery. He is a journalist who focuses on political risk. He talks a lot on this interview about the theft of cargo. Precious cargo, expensive cargo, very interesting topic, something that we have not heard about yet on the show. So it's something I think you guys really enjoy. Go check it out. Nate, if you don't mind, would you be able to give the audience a bio of who you are and your background?
So I'm a Mexico City-based political risk analyst. I've been covering Mexico for over 15 years, writing about organized crime and business issues in the country. I've written articles for the New York Times, for The Guardian, for Fortune, for a number of different magazines. And more recently, I've focused on explaining security issues in different parts of the country, writing for different consultancies and writing reports for entrepreneurs and executives who are trying to understand what it's like to operate a business in Mexico.
When you said a political risk analyst, can you help me understand that? Because I'm personally have never heard that. I'm sure maybe someone has, but can you explain to me what that means?
Yeah, it's just looking at how things like security issues or public policy reforms affect the business environment in a country. So looking at the dynamics in a particular state in Mexico and looking at upcoming elections or upcoming reforms or the current trends in violent crime, organized crime activity, and just how any type of kind of non-financial risk could affect companies that are operating in that area.
Love that. How did you first get into covering this topic of organized crime in Mexico?
So my first job out of college, I worked as a Latin America analyst on Wall Street. So I was doing a lot of research on different countries in the region. Right at the time when Felipe Calderon was coming into office, and Mexico is kind of becoming known around the world for being a drug war country, or a country at war with organized crime groups. And I just became more and more interested in Mexico over time, and really was fascinated by this idea that there were some people saying Mexico was on par with Afghanistan or Pakistan in terms of the risk of it becoming a failed state. And then you had other analysts hyping it up as, the Germany of Latin America and this great emerging industrial economy with a, brilliant future for foreign investments and economic growth. And I kind of had just a very strong interest in trying to investigate and understand how both things could be true at the same time. And then I've spent the next, I guess almost 2 decades now, continuing to investigate those questions.
When did you first hear about the issue with the truck hijacking in Mexico?
So, the truck hijacking issue to me is interesting because I think for a long time it really wasn't something that people talked about. A lot of times people would say, there are cities in Mexico like Tijuana or Ciudad Juarez where there's a lot of organized crime activity and there's a lot of business activity, a lot of foreign investment in factories, and people would just explain that organized crime didn't really mess with legal businesses in Mexico. But maybe around 2019 or so, just working on research, looking at the security dynamics in different parts of Mexico, I started looking at the numbers in Mexico's national crime database, and seeing that they were tracking robberies of cargo truck hijackings, and it wasn't really something I had seen people talk a lot about, but I had the numbers and I was able to, start looking at where the hotspots were, whether or not these were violent hijackings or whether they were non-violent thefts of parked trucks and things like that. Um, and just since then, I've been following it more and more in the news, and I also think that both Mexican media and foreign news outlets have been covering it more and more over the past few years, and it's just become part of the bigger conversation and about security issues in Mexico. It's just taken a long time to get there.
Do you think this is like a significant problem that we all should be paying attention to? And if so, what are some of the worst spots in Mexico that people should be aware of?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's absolutely something that any foreign executives or anyone who's operating a business in Mexico needs to be aware of, and in particular when companies are thinking about opening a factory in one state versus a different state, one city versus a different city. It absolutely needs to be something that they're thinking about. But more generally, I think just for people that are interested in Mexico or, interested in the topic of organized crime in Mexico, I do think that it's very important to understand this trend that armed groups in Mexico are diversifying away from international drug trafficking into preying on businesses. And sometimes it looks like extorting small and medium business owners at the local level. And sometimes it looks like groups of armed gunmen stopping cargo trucks and, driving away with the truck and the cargo. So I do think it's important as a business issue, but it's also important just for people understanding the way organized crime is now operating in Mexico.
Has it become more popular now since the new implementation of, Trump's border security, border enforcement? Has that changed or pivoted maybe some of these organized crime elements to start making money that way instead of transporting of drugs or bodies of human trafficking of some sort?
hmm It's a great question, but I'm honestly not sure how much of an impact the Trump policies have had on this issue. Um, I think one of the biggest trends overall is that the cargo truck hijacking hotspots in Mexico aren't really on the border. So this isn't something that is a huge topic of conversation in Tijuana or um, in San Diego or in El Paso or any of the other border cities. People aren't thinking about it in the same way. The major hotspot for cargo truck hijacking in Mexico is the area around Mexico City, and in particular the highway between Mexico City and the port in Veracruz. So I think this is much more. It's an issue that has a lot more to do with Mexico's policies and Mexico's security strategy for dealing with organized crime, and probably less to do with what the Trump administration is doing.
Is there a connection between the cartel doing this, or is this kind of like other little factions or just kind of small pockets of just, criminal elements that are just making money this way?
Yeah. So one of the biggest problems in Mexico is 99% of all crimes go unsolved. So we do see a few cases of police, especially in Mexico City, successfully investigating and arresting cells of criminals who are engaging in cargo truck hijacking. And a lot of times it seems like it's, smaller groups or local families. Um, Something that's interesting is there's a lot of video footage of this. You can go on YouTube and see dash cam footage of different hijackings. And um, there are cases. There was just a recent case in Veracruz of a truck being stopped and a driver being kidnapped. And the gunmen, kind of look like semi-military, carrying some type of long assault rifles, wearing hooded sweatshirts and face coverings over, covering their faces, concealing their identities. But the overall trend isn't these like super paramilitary groups of kind of guys that look like soldiers in uniforms with flak jackets and helmets and military gear and uh kind of Mad Max style bulletproof trucks. We see videos of those guys. They post videos, when they're talking about different things, and we're not seeing that type of firepower used very frequently in these incidents. A lot of times it's more like guys in hooded sweatshirts with pistols. Um, but the big question is like, where do these guys fit in to the criminal ecosystem in different states in Mexico? And in particular, in a state like Jalisco, where the new generation Jalisco cartel is very powerful. It seems very hard to believe that groups are able to be carrying out these types of assaults every single day without having some type of tacit approval from, senior level guys in the organized crime group. So are these guys like the top level cartel enforcers? That doesn't seem like it's the standard operating procedure, but do they fit in some way to the criminal ecosystem? I think the answer to that is yes. And I think that the general way that people in the trucking and logistics industry talk about this issue is saying that it is organized crime, but it's not like super clear that it's the Sinaloa cartel gunmen who are, increasing their income or looking for additional revenue streams. Um, so, as I said, one of the biggest problems is we don't have a ton of investigations into this issue. So, it's kind of a gray area where we're not entirely clear about who exactly the groups doing it are and where they fit into that organized crime hierarchy.
Is there like a specific cargo that they're targeting more than others?
Yeah, so the number one thing that they try to steal are products that they can sell easily. So tequila is a big product that gets stolen. Any type of food, snacks, anything that can be sold in informal markets, clothing, electronics, beer, soda, and then also, Amazon and Walmart might have trucks stolen, and whatever's in those, in those trucks can generally be resold. But I also think it can be an issue just for, for automotive companies if they're moving, highly specialized automotive parts. Sometimes organized crime groups will hijack trucks just because they want the truck. And so a company might end up losing a very valuable shipment that's key for their manufacturing process, but it isn't necessarily connected to criminals trying to resell the product. It's just criminals trying to steal the truck.
You've been able to ride along with some of these truck drivers, is that correct?
Yeah, so last year I worked on a article for a media outlet called The Hustle, and while working on that project, I contacted a trucker who was going to make a delivery in the state of Mexico on the outskirts of Mexico City, and so I went with him from the warehouse that he leaves from to his delivery point on the outer edge of Mexico City. And one of the strangest things about it is like you look out and you see like all of these logistics hubs and factories, and you see a lot of economic activity. But this guy was explaining to me that, he might hear about one or two colleagues in the area being stopped and kidnapped every single day. And he knows people who have been kidnapped and killed, but this is his job. And he goes out there and he says, he's never actually been he's never been kidnapped. He's never had anything really scary happen to him, but he says like there's definitely stretches of highway in Mexico where he knows when he's driving through, he's going to see some of these, paramilitary style gunmen in masks who are setting up roadblocks and stopping trucks going through. And he's kind of been lucky that, he's stopped at those roadblocks. He's explained who he is and where he's going. And he's never, subsequently suffered one of these, hijacking incidents, but it's just something where he has to think about every day when he's going to work. He tries not to, get too stressed out about it, but it's just a part of his job is that he works in the highest risk area for violent cargo truck hijacking in the entire world. Like, I think the crazy thing about this is like there's like 20,000 of these incidents happening every single year in Mexico. And in the US, we have movies like The Town or, the Fast and Furious movies. And if one of these incidents happens any particular year in the US, it's going to be like a major news story, right? Like this is a crazy type of crime. It's something you see in like action movies. And these incidents are happening every single day in Mexico. 20,000 incidents a year. It's not like an isolated risk. Something in different parts of the world, like executive kidnapping might be something that happens, once or twice a year, but this is happening. There's 50 or 60 of these incidents happening every single day. As I said, even though it is getting more media coverage, I don't think that it's part of the general conversation about Mexico. I don't think that overall people around the world understand that organized crime groups are engaging in this type of activity so frequently.
When you were talking with that truck driver, was there any apprehension for him talking to you? Was he nervous about like giving you too much information, or any kind of union like not supporting you of asking questions of what's going on?
No, I think that like in general, like the trucking unions in Mexico try to draw attention to this issue. They actively try and speak to the media, and they talk about their drivers who have been killed. Um, a driver was just killed yesterday in an attempted hijacking right outside of Mexico City in the state of Hidalgo, and I saw that there's stories in the news about truckers in the state of Puebla near where there's a massive Volkswagen plant. They set up a blockade on the highway because they want attention on this issue. They want people to know how dangerous it is to be a truck driver in Mexico right now, and they want the government to do more to protect them on the roads.
Yeah, that's crazy. When you were riding with him, was there anything that you got to witness that was part of that would be told part of the story? Was there something that maybe the average person listening right now would not have expected to hear?
So the day that I went, there was nothing, particularly scary. We didn't see. He said that like one thing that he does scan for is any type of vehicles that don't have license plates. And during the drive, we were chatting about his experience as a truck driver, but there were never any like close calls where, he all of a sudden told me to look out for a particular pickup truck or an SUV or anything as being a potential threat. But he definitely explained like that's part of what he's looking for as he's driving is, analyzing whether there are any potential situations unfolding that he needs to, keep a close eye on.
How'd you feel? Were you were you nervous if they were gonna potentially hijack one? Like, what were your thoughts on how you were gonna handle it?
Um, so no, I think for me it was a pretty standard day. I mean, it was like I woke up super early in the mornings to take an Uber out to Estado de Mexico, and it was just kind of like a normal day of work. But I've also done a fair bit of work in Mexico. Riding along with um like heavily armed state police patrols, or riding along with paramilitary civilian autodefensa gunmen. So I've definitely been in situations that just visually are a lot crazier with a lot, um, like a lot more action movie type visuals everywhere. So this was more of a standard, just like a standard day of work, more just focused on the way business operates in Mexico. And yeah, we really didn't see anything that was too crazy in that particular day.
Hey guys, I want to give a shout out to a company I've trusted for over 11 years, First Form. They make high quality supplements, protein powders, vitamins, performance products, everything you need to support your health, fitness, and recovery. Look, my weight goes up and down like a lot of us, but when I'm dialed in and focused on my health, these are the products I trust. Their Formula 1 protein powder is my go-to after every workout. Cinnamon Toast Crunch, hands down, is my favorite flavor. I use it after every workout and it tastes amazing. They have other flavors too, like salted caramel, red velvet, and chocolate mint cookie. Not a protein shake person? No problem. Their protein bars taste like candy bars, and my favorite flavor is cookie dough. All the First Form products are made here in the US. No junk, no sketchy ingredients, no BS. Orders over $75 is shipped for free, and if you don't love it, they'll actually give you 110% of your money back. Go check out firstform.com/Borderland now.
When you think about Mexico and sometimes corruption, There's a lot of things that happen in Mexico, and it seems to either get pushed on the rug or people are just complicit because they don't want to affect whether it's a cartel involved or whatnot. Is that something you think is happening with these truck heists? Is that law enforcement is just complicit in it? They just don't see a value in kind of trying to apprehend it? Or is there some kind of corruption in the sense where they're working with these organized crime elements and almost in support of them doing this to try to make money on the side?
So, yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, in general, the issue of corruption is playing a big role, and also just the general issue of institutional weakness in Mexico. Um, but one important factor here is that the main group that's responsible for taking care of security on Mexico's highways is the National Guard. So they're run by the federal government, and they're operating in different areas all across the country. But a lot of what they're doing is more just focused on having patrols out on the road. Um, and there are state police and local police in these different areas, but they're really not responsible for getting onto the highways and pursuing or patrolling for criminals on the federal highways in their state or in their town. Um, so I definitely have heard that there's well-known groups that are operating in particular towns, and those groups are going to enjoy some protection at the local level. And then a bigger question is just, for the governors in these states, they have to be aware of the organized crime activity happening in their state. And if they're not actively pursuing the groups that are engaging in this type of issue, is that, explicitly corruption, or is it just, struggling to deal with so many problems with limited resources? But it does seem like in a lot of these states in central Mexico, there's more and more evidence that particular governors are, fostering ties with organized crime groups. So it does seem like corruption and complicity are a big part of the equation.
That's gotta be frustrating, man. Um, let me, if you don't mind, in my notes, it talks about a case with raw gold theft. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so a few weeks ago, there was a big incident that um, some of the media outlets here are calling the robbery of the century. And again, this is something that you could see in a action movie like Heat, where there was a mining truck that was carrying, I think, 33 tons of gold, like not fully refined gold, but a shipment that's worth millions of dollars. And the truck was accompanied by private security. And this happened in Jalisco near the city of Guadalajara, which is like one of the wealthiest and most successful industrial cities in Mexico. Um, and in this case, gunmen in bulletproof trucks stopped the truck. They kidnapped the driver and all the security people and stole the truck. Um, and the truck was later found, but all of the cargo had been stolen. And then I did just see that the truck was actually stolen again, like it was in police custody in a police parking lot, and gunmen came in and stole it again. So it's a case that's noteworthy, for the value of the goods, for the action movie, you know, visuals of it, and then just for the fact that the truck was actually stolen twice within a few weeks.
Do any of the security in that get killed, or everyone just kind of held hostage, put into the side, and then they moved on?
So in this particular case, it sounds like the driver and the guards weren't hurt. But just Googling articles on this topic, there's a lot of other cases in the last few years where similar sequence of events unfolded, but the gunman ended up shooting and killing security guards during the robbery. And then also, we don't have a ton of information on, like, out of all the drivers that are kidnapped, some of them get killed, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, the gold situation in particular sounds interesting to me. someone who managed a lot of security in my life, it sounds like if no one was killed, then it's an inside job. It's like, because when you're transporting something like gold and you know it's valuable, I think the biggest vulnerabilities is the security efforts, because they know about it and then they tell someone, and if no one gets killed, then that means they're probably in on it. So just a thought, just something that was in my mind.
Yeah, so I think that's also like one of the biggest questions is like when you have these incidents happen, is the driver in on it? Is the company in on it? And I think something that people in the industry say is like, if you really want to protect yourself from cargo truck hijacking in Mexico, more important than hiring security guards is working with vetted local companies that have a reputation for, running tight operations and delivering their shipments on time all the time. And there's definitely cases that like I hear about them and they raise eyebrows. There's one incident of there was a shipment of I think 60 very high-end triathlon bikes that were being sent to a race so people could just fly on the plane. And it's like those bikes might be worth ten to $15,000 per bike. And in that particular case, the first thing I thought when I see it is, you know, did the driver tell anyone about this? Like, how are these criminals? This is such a random shipment that is so high value. Um, but a lot of drivers say like that's also tough for them because like these incidents happen so frequently, and there are some companies that they might fire a driver if he's been robbed twice. But with 60 incidents happening every single day, it's like you could very easily be robbed twice within a 3-year period if you're always driving on, high risk roads. Um, and again, it's just like it goes back to just the absence of any type of real um, investigative capacity. Like if 99% of all homicides are not being solved, and very few violent robberies are ever being solved, the innocent drivers also never get exonerated by investigations, right? So that's like the bad side to it is like it's like you suffer this terrifying incident of being robbed at gunpoint, maybe beaten, kidnapped, put into a trunk, and then released 10 hours later or something. And then for the rest of your career, you're marked as someone who might be colluding with organized crime. So it's like, absolutely, some drivers, especially for smaller companies, are colluding with criminals and, you know, engaging in stealing their own cargo. But for a lot of drivers, it's just tough because they're trying to earn a living, and they might be making $600 a month. Like the salaries for truck drivers in Mexico aren't anywhere close to what truckers in the US are earning. So it's like one more issue with like a job that doesn't pay very well, is very dangerous, and then also could ruin your reputation, in your professional life if you do suffer one of these incidents. So it's a tough situation.
Yeah, and I can't even begin to try and think of a solution, because there's these hijacks happen and they're high valued items. Somebody understands what's in those trucks, right? They're not robbing trucks that have no value. They're robbing trucks that they already know how to make money off of. And it's just fascinating to see how uh, this is happening currently in Mexico. And you don't see that, like you said, in America. You don't see that in specific places. So it takes a lot of things to go wrong for it to be so prevalent and be so active currently at this moment. I just think it's just interesting. You said that you spoke with, I believe the acronym is CSEN, the
Mhm.
Mexico's intelligence company. What do they have to say about it? Like, are they trying to make any efforts in this? Is this not a big enough issue for them to try and work on some intel and seeing how they can slow it down or mitigate it by any means?
Yeah, so CSEN was kind of like Mexico's CIA. It was disbanded. So this guy is now working in the private sector. Um, a lot of his job focuses on if a particular company is getting targeted by hijackings on a consistent basis, he helps study the particular dynamics of, that city or that state and figure out, what are the groups that are actually doing, that are actually engaging in these robberies and harming the company, and then trying to work with local police and state police to figure out if there's a solution to it. But in this case, it's like maybe the local police aren't doing that intelligence work at the local level. I mean, in general, with just like the almost near total failure of Mexico's judicial system, um, which sounds extreme, but again, when 99% of all murders are never being solved, it's hard to describe that in any other way than near total failure, right? Um, so this is like a very his perspective is, again, that most times these groups are classified as organized crime, but it's not high level cartel gunmen. But something he said is like, sometimes in Mexico, I think about, like, in different states, how powerful is the private sector, how powerful is the government, and then how powerful is organized crime. And he said in many towns and cities in different parts of central Mexico, it's really hard to use that framework, because a lot of times there's almost total overlap between those three groups, where you might have powerful entrepreneurs who are also in politics, who are also connected to organized crime, who are also reselling, stolen merchandise in the different markets and stores that they might own. So it's a really tough issue. And I know that Mexico's current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, talks about wanting to improve police intelligence and investigations. And she's saying the right things. And it seems like there's some hope, like in Mexico City in particular. It does seem like police and prosecutors have been doing a better job recently, but Mexico City has 90,000 state police officers, where the neighboring state of Morelos, where, extortion, cargo truck hijacking are both big problems, there's only 2,000 state police officers in the whole state. And Morelos right now is 3 times as violent as the city of Chicago. So, like, we think of Chicago as being one of the hotspots for violence in the US, and it's a city. And Morelos as an entire state is like 3 times beyond that. So that to me just shows, talking about investing in intelligence and investigations is very different than, allocating billions of dollars to building up Mexico's local police and training prosecutors and, massively trying to reduce that 99% impunity rate. So overall, I would just say, right now, my take on the current strategy is there's like lip service to saying the right things about wanting to invest in intelligence, but the money isn't there to back it up.
Man, the U.S. has a lot of products that come in through Mexico. Has there been U.S. companies that are hit by this same problem? And if so, what are some of the things that maybe the U.S. has implemented? Are they eating those losses? Is it just like going straight to insurance, or what have you heard about that?
Yeah, definitely. So this absolutely is an issue that has affected some major U.S. companies and other foreign companies. As I mentioned, Amazon and Walmart have both been hit by this issue. Pepsi and Coca-Cola for years have been facing problems in southern Mexico, in particular with armed robberies of their delivery trucks. Apple had a major incident in Guadalajara where an armored truck carrying $1 million worth of iPhones was taken in a hijacking, and in that particular incident, the truck was recovered. But there's one other case also in Jalisco, which is it's on YouTube. People can try to find it on YouTube and look at it. There's footage of it, but this is probably one of the craziest cases. And this was GM was sending some luxury Chevrolet pickup trucks through Jalisco, and these kind of action movie paramilitary gunmen, most likely from the new generation Jalisco cartel, stopped stop the new car carrier, and then over the course of half an hour, we're able to unload all of the trucks and then drive away, stopping traffic on the highway for that amount of time. And, it wasn't gone in 60 seconds. It took them, half an hour, and they were they were able to do it. So that's probably the craziest example of this happening. But overall, we're still talking about 50 to 60 of these incidents every single day, where right now it's around 6 million trucks crossing from Mexico into the US every single year. So that's around 16,000 trucks crossing into the US every single day. So 50 or 60 out of 16,000 is still not, it's not an insurmountable obstacle if companies feel like they can make money, and that Mexico is part of their, their strategic vision for their company. They can certainly make it work. And there are also insurance solutions for companies. I know there's a company called Reliance Partners in the US that is working to help companies with insurance policies that cover them from the exit point in Mexico all the way to their point of final delivery in the US. And I think that's an interesting thing, that if insurance companies are interested in covering this problem, it shows that for businesses, it's still a viable issue. It's not something where insurance companies are saying like, hey, this is such a big problem that there's no way that we can make a business out of selling insurance to cover it. So I still think that overall, as big as this problem is, businesses aren't saying like, oh, well, there's no way we can successfully operate a factory in Mexico if we have to deal with this type of robberies on such a frequent basis. And then finally, there's like GPS equipment. Like a lot of companies are investing in putting GPS equipment in their trucks, in their trailers, and then also on their cargo. And they can also invest in monitoring services so they can see if, for instance, if the trailer is opened on the highway, they can flag the issue. They can remotely shut down the motor. So there's definitely technological solutions that companies can invest in, and there's a lot of security advisory companies that are using some of this GPS data in a real-time fashion to provide advice on emerging hotspots on particular sections of highway, or particular towns that highways cross through. But yeah, overall, companies are working to find solutions, but it's still, it's still a pretty significant risk for any company that's operating in central Mexico.
Based on everything you've seen, who you've talked to, what do you think the next 6 to 12 months looks like? Do you think this is going to get worse? Is there any kind of relief in sight of potential changes or shifts that could hopefully help these drivers and these cargo not get hijacked?
So it's tough. Like I would say I don't foresee this problem deteriorating, getting significantly worse in the next 6 months, but I also don't see that Mexico is on any type of path to really successfully address this issue. So my overall take is it's likely to, stay about the same for the next several years. And in general, I think it's just a sign that a lot of times people talk about organized crime in Mexico as if it's focused just on drug trafficking. But I think this is a sign, and especially for Mexico, if you do have politicians in Mexico who for, the last 50 years have been willing to kind of turn a blind eye to drug trafficking, maybe thinking that it's beneficial to have billions of dollars of revenue flowing into Mexico as like a, bonus economic development catalyst or something. This should be a wake-up call that organized crime activity in Mexico is, rapidly diversifying into extortion and other types of crime that do affect the local population. So it's no longer something where policymakers and politicians in Mexico can think about the organized crime issue as something that mainly affects, drug users in the US, or mainly affects, other countries. It's definitely an issue where organized crime is having a big impact at the local level in Mexico.
You've also been inside of Avocado parking facility outside of Mexico City, and you say that it's run by organized crime. How did you first come across that story?
Yeah, so this was probably one of the craziest projects that I've done in Mexico, and my first introduction to the state of Michoacan, right outside of Mexico City, is one of the major hotspots for organized crime activity in Mexico. Some people might be familiar with a group called La Familia Michoacana, which obviously has its geographical base there. But in 2014, I really kind of got my start covering organized crime in Mexico. I had done a couple of projects in, Ciudad Juarez or in Tamaulipas, but this was like the first time I really got to see a lot of this stuff up close. And I went I went to Michoacan and I had the chance to interview some of these civilian armed groups who were um, organizing themselves and trying to push out organized crime activity from their states. And these were really groups that, it's like something out of a Mad Max movie. They had SUVs with steel plates um, welded over the windows, and they had all different types of, military style weapons. And so this was like a huge story at the time, 2013, 2014, 2015. And when I really went to see how the avocado industry, this is a $1 billion, multi-billion dollar export industry. How is this industry able to operate when its base is in the state, which is dealing with these like insane security issues? And I went to a town of it's called Tancitro, and it's kind of seen as being like the avocado capital of Mexico. And the things I saw there were totally insane. Like all around the town, they had these stone castles with like vertical windows, like almost like a medieval castle. And you had all these like civilian gunmen with AK-47s and M16s who are guarding all of these castles all around the town. And then I visited different avocado farms, and it was just this really surreal environment where these legitimate avocado entrepreneurs are operating these businesses that are, subject to inspections by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they're meticulously managed when it comes to, pesticides and, insects and, different type of normal agricultural agribusiness issues. And then right outside of the orchard, you're just seeing like guys lounging around on sofas, cradling assault rifles over their laps. So it's just like a really crazy thing to be able to witness directly. And one of the things that I saw there was like people would tell me there are legitimate businessmen that are operating here, but there are also orchard owners who were killed, and their orchards are still operating. So who's operating those orchards? And in general, like there's no banks, there's no big banks in these towns. So people are coming in from other places and they're investing in, millions of dollars of equipment and planting trees and building up these businesses. But it's never really clear to anyone, like, is this just a wealthy family? Is this a investment fund? Like, who's backing these projects? And in a lot of cases, it's likely that it is organized crime, but there's no attention. Like, that was the crazy thing to me, is like, there's all of this attention to like, they inspect all of the crates looking to see if there's any type of insect that could, come to the U.S. and cause problems for farmers in the U.S. But there's just in general been very little interest in looking at the connections between organized crime and the avocado sector. So with the particular family that I looked at, like there was a well-known family where they were like leaders in the local avocado growing association. They had also been, they had tried to like co-opt the autodefensa movement. But one of the main brothers in the family had been killed, and people in the town told me that it was people in the town who had hired hitmen to come from outside of the town to kill him because they knew that he had been kind of behind efforts to extort other business owners in the town. And, there had been problems with people in the town being kidnapped and being extorted and being threatened by organized crime. And they felt like this guy from this powerful family was the one behind it, and they hired people to kill him. But when I was there, people will still explain to me like these guys are like the power brokers here. Like they control the Avocado Growers Association. They kind of work behind the scenes to make sure that the mayor of the town works for them. They financed the craziest local police force in Mexico. Like I was able to ride in, I believe it was a Cadillac Escalade with bulletproof windows, and all of these guys look like legitimate soldiers, with M16s, and they were all driving bulletproof trucks. And in my opinion, this has to be the craziest local police force in Mexico. There's just no other force that has, this type of funding for this type of equipment. So that was kind of the overall context for the town. But in the course of my time there, I was there for about 10 days while I was working on this project for my a chapter of my book. And I really wanted to see if I could visit one of the facilities that was owned by this family. And so I was able to get an interview with the head of the Avocado Growers Association, and I talked to him, and he offered to let me visit one of his sites. So I got to show up in the morning, and from the outside, it looked very similar to a lot of the other buildings in the city, but there were some kind of differences. Like I saw a lot of the trucks in the parking lot, like instead of being kind of like beat up old cars that minimum wage workers might drive, there were a lot of like luxury, futuristic looking luxury pickup trucks. And I saw a guy showing up at work and getting out of his truck, and he was carrying he was like a well-dressed office worker with gelled hair, and he was carrying an AK-47 with him. So I was able to talk to some of the guys there, and one of the guys from the family was probably one of the scariest guys I've ever interacted with. Like, I didn't speak to him for very long, but I just felt like he was someone who, I didn't really want to spend very much time with, and I was very happy to not have to, spend the whole day with him. He just I told him that I wanted to tour the facility and see the trucks leaving and everything, and he put me in touch with the plant, the floor manager, and she kind of gave me the whole tour. But really one of the wild things that I was able to see was they showed me, all of the avocados coming in from the different orchards and how they're, packed into crates. And I watched them loading them into trucks, and they were telling me, in 28 hours, this particular truck is going to be in a Sam's Club in the US. And there's, big companies, like well-known produce companies, that are buying these avocados. And then, obviously all of the big name supermarkets in the US are buying avocados from this town. So that was like a particular, very unique opportunity where I had to see like what's the overlap between organized crime and legitimate business. And it was that, that window of looking into a truck and hearing someone tell me like this is going to be in a Sam's Club in 28 hours, and just seeing like the connection between legal business in the US and organized crime in Mexico is, much tighter than people might imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, that's crazy. So just there's corruption happening there, but as that's happening, we're getting our avocados here in America, and people don't identify the two. I've heard there's, cartels like CJNG or whatnot have been able to get themselves into a position to own part of these avocado orchards and whatnot, and the businesses, just by way of corruption, obviously. You mentioned in your book, and if you don't mind, go ahead and please plug your book, but you mentioned the Mexico paradox. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so definitely. So As I mentioned at the start of the podcast, like one of the big questions I wanted to answer in looking at Mexico is just this idea of how is Mexico, such a successful export-oriented economy, and also, um, maybe the craziest country on the planet in terms of organized crime activity. Um, so that was something in 2012. I talked to a well-known um, Mexican executive named Claudio X Gonzalez, and he kind of summed it up as like, how is it possible that, cities like Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez are able to be successful export hubs at the same time where they're like hotspots for incredible levels of cartel violence? And he summed it up as, the Mexico paradox is just one of the quirks of modern Mexico. Um, but in the course of my book is called Searching for a Modern Mexico, and that was like one of the big questions I wanted to look at. And I think that it's not an accident that Mexico is all of these things at the same time, right? Like Mexico has, um, almost 24 billionaire families, and then it also has like half the workforce working in the informal economy. And Mexico is sometimes ranked as being one of the best places to do business in Latin America. The World Bank used to rank it right alongside Chile for having, on paper, some of the best regulations for, being an easy place to open and operate a business. But at the same time, Mexico always appears in rankings as being, one of the worst countries in the entire world for institutional strength, for rule of law, and for organized crime. And so my general takeaway is that sometimes Mexico is thought of as being a middle income country, but I really think it's a country of total extremes where there really isn't a functional middle class. You do have these very powerful billionaire families, and then you have half the workforce in informal sector jobs. And maybe a more contemporary example of the Mexico paradox might be Mexico is still ranked as being, the third worst country in the world for organized crime activity. 200,000 people were killed during the last 6 years during the former president's time in office. And at the same time, we're seeing stories in the news about all of these Americans who are, wanting to come and work from Mexico City, right? So it's like, how is it possible that, we're hearing about all this crazy organized crime activity, violent organized crime rackets that are preying on innocent people, and not just this idea that, it's just cartel gunmen fighting each other in the mountains. It's not. It's cartels carjacking people in all of the highways around Mexico City. It's businesses, suffering these violent cargo truck hijacking incidents. And maybe the way to look at it is to look at the issue of Mexico City. And people talk about this issue of gentrification in Mexico City, and looking at some of the numbers of that is like, if you're a young kid in the US, and you're earning $30,000 a year and you can work remotely, that salary in Mexico puts you in the top 1% of salaries in Mexico City, right? So like most people in Mexico City are earning around $6,000 a year. So you have, incredibly wealthy families in different neighborhoods in Mexico City who are running businesses and, earning a ton of money. And then you have almost everybody earning around $6,000 a year. And
That's
to me,
crazy.
that's crazy, right? It's like the top 1% is earning over $30,000 a year. And some of that might be that like a lot of the money in Mexico is like off the books. And I think there is a lot more money in Mexico than like the official numbers on income show. And it might be that there are, guys with cattle businesses or avocado businesses who are not involved in organized crime, but just have a ton of income that's not showing up in their tax statements. But overall, the general pattern of extreme inequality to me is the biggest answer. Like, how is it possible that this Mexico paradox exists? And it's because Mexico is, such an unequal country. And that's how you can have these, big areas of different states that are almost not really governed by the government anymore. And then you have pockets in Guadalajara and Monterrey and Mexico City that are arguably, better quality of life than LA or Miami or New York. So, um, just in general, I think the Mexico paradox continues to be a good tool for explaining Mexico, because I think it is important to remember, like, as crazy as all the violence is in Mexico, it's not 100% of the story, right? Like, there's still a lot of positive trends of real estate developments and, restaurants opening, and, a lot of neighborhoods in the country are, absolutely world class in terms of quality of life right now. But that's existing in a context of, extreme inequality and also overall institutional weakness.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the billionaire families. I imagine how many of those have ties to some kind of cartel as well, and also legitimate businesses. It feels that very successful legitimate businesses have a potential to still be connected to some kind of organized crime organization by way of either just funding, investment, or some kind of the cartel pivoting into trying to do kind of a legitimate business style, almost like other kind of organized crime in the history of organized crime, trying to go straight at some point and have their money make them money, and eventually maybe just kind of wander off into the sunset financially. But I'm curious about that, and really there is no question there, other than I imagine that that's the reality of Mexico, is that there is some organized crime that pays for a lot of these legitimate businesses, and legitimate businesses at times it's almost hard for them not to be successful without the assistance of some kind of organized crime element.
Yeah, definitely. I think I had the chance to visit Culiacan and Sinaloa, which is like the hometown of El Chapo
No,
Guzman and like a
no,
major
really,
base for
yeah.
the Sinaloa cartel. And I have to say that when I went, I was totally blown away by the level of real estate development, and like visually it looks like Fort Lauderdale. And I feel like that was a failure of a lot of journalists, is like people talk about the violence there and they kind of describe it as like a dystopia, but they don't explain that, like, El Chapo's son was killed in front of like a modern looking strip mall that like could be in San Diego or something, right? Like, visually you see a lot of money in a lot of these cities, and that's kind of one of the big open questions about Mexico, is like how much of the success story is cartel money being funneled into, real estate developments. And, and maybe for anyone who's interested in the topic of, gentrification in Mexico, that's a big question that's worth looking at, is like, if a city like Guadalajara or Monterrey or Mexico City is, dealing with gentrification and urban redevelopment, like how many of these luxury condo buildings that are springing up everywhere are, laundering cartel money? And we don't have answers right now, but it does seem like that's a big, a big issue, a big question about Mexico. And one final thing that I think is like important for the overall, anyone interested in Mexico, but in particular for executives and entrepreneurs who are looking at um, Mexico right now as a place to operate a business, is this issue of the new focus in the US on penalizing individuals and companies who fund terrorist organizations. And I think that creates an entirely new level of seriousness for companies. Like right now, we have seen the Trump administration raise the alarms about a couple of banks in Mexico for being involved in um, facilitating fentanyl-related drug trafficking activity and transactions. But the potential risk there now is huge, right? Like if you're a supermarket and you are buying avocados from a from a company that is owned or affiliated with a designated terrorist organization. Like that's a huge potential risk for, the next 10 years. For banks, for real estate development companies, what's the level, of culpability, right? Like any seemingly legitimate business could be conceivably tied to financing terrorist activity if they are engaging in business with people and they're not 100% sure of who those people are. And I was just talking to someone about this yesterday, and I said, I still think this is a potential risk issue. Like we're not seeing the Trump talking about this or actively pushing for investigations and prosecutions of U.S. companies who are operating in Mexico. But it's like a boulder hanging at the edge of a cliff, right? Like in the future, at any point, if there are prosecutors in the U.S. who are interested in pursuing that angle as a way for curbing organized crime activity in Mexico or really trying to take down organized crime, it might be that there are major legitimate companies in the US that kind of end up in the crosshairs and, suffer a big fallout because they're unwillingly doing significant levels of business with cartel affiliated businesses in Mexico.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly, it's a slippery slope. We just recently had someone get caught buying stolen crude oil from, from the cartel. And so there's a lot of that as well. So it's kind of wild. Well, Nate, I really appreciate your time, man. I thank you for your education on all this. This is very fascinating. It's the first time I've ever heard anything like it. So it was interesting for me to hear. Really appreciate it. If there's anything you want to tell the audience about your book as well, please do. And I hope we're going to have to circle back and do another round of this. This went a lot faster than I expected.
Yeah, for sure. It's, super interesting to get the chance to chat about this topic. And I feel like it's important for people covering and studying Mexico to study organized crime and business at the same time. I think probably for too long, the two topics have been kind of siloed, where, some people are really interested in the organized crime stuff and the security stuff, and other people are interested in the economic development story. And I think you absolutely have to study both at the same time to really understand what's going on. So it's super interesting to get the chance to chat with you about this. And yeah, for anyone interested in, hearing more about my work on this topic, my book is called Searching for Modern Mexico, and I tell the story of different entrepreneurs in different states in Mexico who are trying to build businesses, exporting coffee from Chiapas, mezcal from Oaxaca, avocados from Michoacan, beer from Guadalajara, and a taco entrepreneur in Tijuana. So I got the chance to really hear the stories of a lot of these entrepreneurs and spend, significant amounts of time with them and really get to tell their story in a pretty narrative way that's accessible and fun. So yeah, anyone interested in learning more about the topic can check out my book, or my podcast is called the Modern Mexico Podcast. And I talk about a lot of these issues on there. And then just the last thing I would say on this topic is, like, if there are any people that are just interested more in security issues in general, or only tangentially interested in Mexico, I think that this issue of cargo truck hijacking specifically should be on the radar of security experts and policy experts in the US, because I do think that there is a risk that the groups that are developing the expertise and learning about how to identify and steal shipments from within the supply chain are also learning how to do it in a less violent and more sophisticated way in the US. But it does seem likely that the growth of this type of cargo theft happening in the US could also be tied to the same groups that are doing it in Mexico. So that might be something that over the next few years we get, better intelligence and investigations into that. But I would just label it as a potential risk that's important for the US as a standalone issue within the US, and not just as a issue that's of interest for people that are interested in learning about Mexico.
Yep, I agree. It's interesting. Yeah, I'm interested to see where this goes. I'm going to kind of follow it a little bit more. But again, thank you so much for your time and really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. Great to chat with you.
Thank you for listening to Borderland Narcosis, an Ironclad original, presented by First Form. Check out your supplements. Don't forget firstform.com/Borderland. We'll see you next time.
How close, you mentioned this a little bit, that we've gotten relatively close to letting one of these things off the chain. How close do you think it's actually gotten? Not an accidental, like, whoopsie, push the wrong button here, but a targeted use of a nuclear weapon.
I think we've come close a number of times. There's a wonderful book by a scholar named Scott Sagan called The Limits of Safety, who talks about this very issue. The Soviets came very close to launching a retaliatory strike on a phantom radar image. I believe it was in 1983. The Soviets came close to launching a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October of 1962 in response to the United States Navy forcing submarines up, Soviet submarines during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There have been a number of other occasions, and probably some we don't know about, where the Soviets and the United States came close. The Soviets considered using nuclear weapons against China during their skirmishing and military conflicts of the late 1960s. So I think it's really luck that has prevented, in great measure, an accidental or misperceived use of nuclear weapons to this point. I am not at all calm or sanguine. I don't suffer from the 40th Ford problem. I think that many people suffer from. I think the more countries that have their finger on the trigger, that have the capability, that have the means to deliver them, I think at a certain point, it's a near certainty. Now, I don't know. Timing is everything, right? I know that eventually the sun will grow and swallow up the earth. That doesn't really occupy my mental space too much because it's going to be so far in the future. But I think the possibility...
We don't know what's happening next week.
Well, that's true.
I'm also hopeful that is long in the future.
There's asteroids. There's other things that can cause extinction level events, and you raise a good point. But again, I don't let that fill my headspace. But I think pretty frequently about how close we've come before to the use of nuclear weapons and what that might mean once we cook one off. And I think a lot about the current international environment and the incentives and uncertainties that have become injected into the environment recently, and how that might incentivize horizontal nuclear proliferation, and what that might mean for the likelihood of an accidental or intentional nuclear war.